area to join us to talk about neuroscience. For those of you who are online or will be online eventually, we're having a little trouble with the live stream, but we're trying to work it out. But in any case, you will be able to watch this conversation archived at the site journalism.nyu.edu/KC. So with that, I will introduce our host for the evening, Robert Lee Holtz, distinguished writer in residence here at the Carter Institute and science writer at the Wall Street Journal.
Thank you, Professor Fagan. So welcome to the Kavli Conversation on Science Communication. So this is the fourth in our spring series, our inaugural spring series. And I should just emphasize, this is indeed sponsored by the Kavli Foundation and by NYU's Science, Health, and Environmental Reporting Program. Looking to the future, on May 4th, we'll be joined by noted author and paleoanthropologist Ian Tattersall from the American Museum of Natural History here in New York, and the noted Science magazine correspondent Ann Gibbons will be traveling from her base in Pittsburgh to join us to talk about the very touchy subject of human origins. Just to remind you, the Kavli Conversation this evening, hopefully, but in the future, they're webcast nationally. And those of you who do get to watch this online tonight can join the conversation by tweeting questions to us via the hashtag KavliConvo. That'll go under the screen periodically to help you out. And those of you who are here with us in person at NYU this evening can join the conversation simply by stepping up to the microphone and speaking clearly. Tonight we're talking about a particularly compelling topic, the confluence of violence, brain development, and public health. What happens to children who are subsumed in the stress of urban violence? It's a question driven these days by a cascade of new developments into the effects of experience and the environment on the developing brain. And it's an area rife with potential pitfalls of politics and prejudice. As science communicators, how do we navigate this minefield? Well, let's see tonight what we can learn from a journalist who covers the public health impact of urban violence and from a neuroscientist who reaches out to the public about the neurobiology of rage. So first, let me welcome Andrea McDaniels. She's an award-winning health reporter from the Baltimore Sun. For more than a year, Andrea examined the unseen impact of violence on children, caregivers, and the relatives of victims through the microscope of a particularly troubled neighborhood in a city where last year more people were murdered than at any time in more than a generation. Her 2014 three-part series called Collateral Damage highlighted the impact of traumatic stress on children's health and the development of the young brain. Now, the series was named the best public health story of 2014 by the Association of Healthcare Journalists and was awarded the 2015 AAAS Kavli Science Journalism Award by the American Association for the Advancement of Science. And we're also joined by Douglas Fields, who by day is a developmental neurobiologist who studies how the human brain changes over time, as well as how brain cells interact and neural circuits form memories in response to experience. But more importantly, for our purpose, he is a scientist who has felt the special obligation to reach out to the public about new research in his specialty. His recent book, which I, by some strange coincidence, have a copy of right here, Why We Snap, looks at how we sometimes cannot control our rage. It looks at what we are learning about the underlying neurobiology of anger, stress, and violence. It's his second book on new brain research, And I should say that he derives his authority from his position as the section chief for the Nervous System Development and Plasticity at the National Institutes of Health in Bethesda, Maryland. And in addition to serving on several neuroscience journals on their boards, he's also a scientific advisor for Odyssey, Scientific American Mind magazines. He's written for Outside, for the Washington Post magazine, Scientific American and Scientific American Mind. And he publishes regularly on Huffington Post and Psychology Today. So where we are tonight we are looking at really a matter of cause and effect. Violence on the street, violence in the home, violence in the brain. And I'd like to start by asking for any communicator the basic question: who do you see as your audience? Who are you writing for? And Andrea, let me ask you that first.
Well, I'm writing for the general public. So I'm writing about science, which is very complex and takes a lot of reporting and a lot of understanding. But I want to write it in a way that the general population can understand how it affects their lives and why science is important in their lives. So in the instance of collateral damage, you know, the science helped prove what people in, you know, violent neighborhoods have known for years, that this violence is affecting them, but the science helped give validity to that.
So when you write on these topics, you're writing for your readers, of course, but I mean, do you have a reader in mind? Newspapers are often quite puzzled by who their readers are, why readers come to them. So that's why I was trying to get a better sense of who it is in Baltimore that you're reaching out to.
I don't have a particular person, but I want the person in, I don't know, not only the Johns Hopkins graduate, which we have many of in Baltimore, and they're scientists and they understand this, but I want the person in the neighborhood I wrote about, Druid Heights, Upton, to understand it as well. So I don't want to dumb it down to a kindergarten level, but I want to make it so anybody in Baltimore can understand it.
And so, Doug, let me turn the same question to you, because of course now, as a professional matter, as a neuroscientist, you're habitually writing for a peer-reviewed audience of other people in your specialty. But when you reach out through popular literature, if I can call it that, who are you aiming at?
I'm aiming at the general public. In particular, in this book, it was a subject that I think has great social implications. I didn't want to write a book on the neuroscience of rage and have it sit in a library. I didn't want to write an academic book. But at the same time, I wanted to bring the latest in science to the general public. So I'm trying to synthesize both, and that's hard. But in general, I'm trying to write for everyone. I'm trying to write for high school kids, teachers, taxi drivers, anybody who's interested in science, because I think we're all scientists. I think we're all interested in the world around us. We're interested in how our bodies work. You know, when I talk to people in everyday conversation, I talk about science. I find everyone's fascinated by it.
So, Andrea,
can I just piggyback off of that? And
please,
also,
please.
you said people interested in science, but also maybe people who don't know they're interested in science and don't realize they're reading the science story until after the fact. Even one of my colleagues in the newsroom was like, you know, that was a science story. I didn't even realize it till afterwards, but you had a whole lot of science, but because you related it to the lives of real people, you know, we didn't think of it as a science story. So also getting people
So
into science.
let me ask you, how did you come to your project? And this was a year-long effort. That's a long time in the life of a daily journalist. It's a big commitment, perhaps, for a metropolitan daily to make to a topic. Did you start out conceiving this as, oh, you know what, I think there's a lot of stuff about neuroscience that people ought to learn about, or did you start out with the impact of the violence itself?
Yeah.
I mean, social impact.
Right. So I, at the last minute, decided I was going to apply to a health fellowship at USC, and I had like 2 nights to come up with an idea. So I was like, what am I going to do? What am I going to do? And I kept thinking about back to all these health reports that I get every year from both the state health department and the Baltimore City Health Department, and it always lists violence as one of the biggest health disparities in both the state and particularly in Baltimore. So I kept thinking, so I approached it as, well, how is violence a health issue? We know that a lot of people in Baltimore die from violence, but beyond that, you know, what are the health implications of violence? And it wasn't until after I started doing the reporting that I found there was so much science on it that I didn't know about. And I thought, if, you know, I'm a health medical science reporter, if I don't know about it, then, you know, other people probably don't know about it either. So I was pleasantly surprised at all the science that was out there. And I thought it helped make the story even more important. And like I said, add validity to the issue as well.
And let me ask you, Doug, the same question. You're running a busy and productive NIH research branch. You've got your own peer-reviewed publications that you're pushing through the pipeline. Why undertake this underpaid, underappreciated perhaps by your colleagues, public outreach effort? I mean, why write a book? Why write more than one book? Why blog?
Mm-hmm. I think you're asking in general and not particularly about this book. So I love science. I love doing it. I love talking about it, reading about it, sharing it. And so that's a lot of fun for me. And I got started in writing for the public by writing an article for Scientific American. And so your question is, why did I do that?
So you started at the top.
Well, but your question is, why did I do that? And it has to be because as a teenager, that's where I got my science, and from reading the popular science. And I always was a scientist. Even in high school, I was one of these people who always knew what I wanted to do, but I wasn't reading, you know, Nature. I was reading Scientific American or whatever the equivalents were. So I was excited to share and do what I could about bringing, at the time, a very new idea that there was 85% of the cells in the brain that no one knew about. They don't use electricity. They're called glia, and that was exciting. So I wrote this article, and then I got a email from a literary agent, said, I'm an agent, would you like to write a book? And so I deleted it. I didn't know what a literary agent is.
Really?
And a week later, I got the same email, deleted that. I don't know. I write papers. I don't know what a literary agent is. And then a week later, the same guy, another one. It's not asking for money or to enlarge any parts of my anatomy or anything, so I decided to go ahead and reply. And he explained, you know, how you make a book proposal and what an agent is. And I said, okay. And so that's how I got started.
Really?
And took it from there.
Because you had so much free time.
Well, yeah. You know, you make time.
Well, no, I am curious. Okay, so if I may just for a second. So that's great. And the current book is on the neurobiology of violence.
Yes.
For federal researchers, research on violence over the decades has been a perilous area for a lot of reasons. Some of them because of missteps and misinterpretations of the research itself, but also because it's a very sensitive topic out with the general public. So I'm curious why you chose to dangle your big toe into the bear trap of research into violent behavior.
Well, that's a very good question, which relates to a larger issue, that any of my writing has nothing to do with my research. It has to be, and this book is I'm speaking in personal capacity. I'm not speaking on behalf of the NIH, and I have to always make that clear. But there is this problem. No matter what I write about, almost, it's going to have some social or political implications. So it doesn't matter what I write. If I write about marijuana, which I have 3 times so far, there's going to be a political aspect, right? If I write about an FDA decision, there's going to be pros and cons. So I have to make it very clear that I'm speaking as a private citizen. But I think that's very important in journalism. I think that I think we need to do that.
Okay, so Andrea here is coming to her to the research in her reporting, and she's bolstered by the reports that she's seen over the years, the public thing. Now, I wonder, you're kind of seeing a lot of this research before it actually becomes public. I mean, in a broad sense, either through your role as a peer reviewer, or as because you're just privy to the grant-making mechanism at NIH. Does this kind of give you a leg up? I mean, you're really finding out about advances a long time before someone like Andrea or I would be in a position to. Does this like help you as a popular writer?
Yes, and I think that it's important that that's something that I have to contribute because I am a scientist. Any working scientist knows what's going to come out in your field 5 years from now, all right? Journalists are excited when they get the 1 week advance notice, right? But scientists have heard this already in meetings. We've peer-reviewed the papers. In fact, 5 years earlier, we probably saw the grant proposal. So we know what's coming out in our field. And that, I'm not here to compete with journalists. I'm here to bring something different, and so that helps. But it does also have a problem, and that is, you know, when you have something new in science, a new discovery in science, even trying to explain it to your peer who is not an expert in that field, it doesn't get it. So imagine pitching this to an editor. And a good example was my first article on glia. I pitched that to Scientific American, and the editor replied, glia, well, we've never heard of this before. Now that would normally be the end. But instead they said, sounds like a big deal, interesting. But I've also had where I pitched an article and I just couldn't get the idea across. It was rejected. This was my first pitch, actually, as a graduate student. But the rejection letter was so nice, I kept it. It was very nice. And I carried it all around the country for 18 years. And then I resubmitted the article to the same popular science magazine 18 years later, and they took it. And I sent, when it was published, I sent a bottle of 18-year-old scotch to the editor. And turned out she didn't drink. I thought all you guys drank like fish, but apparently not. So we do have this problem that, of course, it's, you know, added challenge to bring these ideas that are really on the fringe of science. You know, and I have the same thing when I hear about gravity waves. You know, I understand it, you know, at pretty superficial level.
Well, that's interesting because, of course, we're eager for scoops, right? We want to be ahead of the curve, and what you're telling me is if you get too far ahead of the curve, you get greeted with silence when you bring some of these things up. Andrea, I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about your process as you launched into this very long focus on the particular neighborhood, the Upton Druid Hills neighborhood. Could you tell us why you picked that particular area to zoom in on, and then how the neuroscience of this started to work its way into your reporting?
Well, initially I didn't pick that neighborhood. It wasn't until several months after I started the reporting. I initially went in just trying to find, my biggest focus is trying to find real people that fit the story in the best way possible. So I thought people would relate better to real stories. So I called all kinds of people. First I thought I was going to do former gang members, but they don't really want to talk.
So when you say people who fit the story,
yes.
You've already got kind of a broad topic outline,
right.
and you're now kind of looking for human narratives.
Exactly. Because, I mean, to be honest, the idea was all over the place. I knew violence impacted health, but I spent a lot of months like narrowing it down just by doing a lot of reporting, and as you said, finding the narratives that fit the story. So I started with the gang members who were in wheelchairs, because I thought, you know, they'd be good examples, but nobody wanted to talk. I think because some of them, I don't know, are still not necessarily gang members, but still know people, and there's a lot of distrust, and you know, they don't want to talk to a journalist and have all their business in the newspaper. And then I reached out to adult daycare centers, and that's where I found, I did one of the stories in the series was about people who were victims of violence years ago, and how, like the one guy I talked to, how he's still in a wheelchair. He was shot when he's 18, he's still in a wheelchair, living at home with his mom in his mom's basement, and his mom has been taking care of him all these years. And if you talk to him, he still has the mentality of an 18-year-old. He has, you know, 18-year-olds think about sex a lot. He has a mug with boobs on it in his room, and his mom takes him to the strip club and like push it, you know, I have this image of him, she pushes him in and runs off, but you know, that's what she wants to do for her son. I'm rambling a little bit. And then I went through schools and I went through social workers, because in Baltimore there's a lot of, Baltimore, we call Baltimore Smaltimore. It's a city of neighborhoods. A lot of people, Smaltimore.
Yeah.
Smaltimore, yep. A lot of people don't move. Everybody knows everybody. So if people didn't know me, they weren't necessarily going to talk to me openly. So I tried to work through social workers who knew people in the community and could, you know, be that in between to help me gain the trust of that. And we landed on the Upton Druid Heights neighborhood because there was a program called Promise Heights. Promise Heights is a federal program where they put social workers in the schools, and remarkably, they were addressing the exact same issues that I wanted to write about. So they had social workers in the schools dealing with, you know, kids who had short attention spans, behavioral problems, and instead of punishing the kids, they would work with them to help deal with these issues.
Can I ask
And that
you
was
a
all
rude
because of
question?
violence.
Can I ask
Sure.
you a rude question? You know, a lot of people become science journalists
Mhm.
because they like journalism, but they
Mhm.
really don't like dealing with
Mhm.
unpleasantness.
Right.
You know,
Yeah.
they like nice, clean researchers in nice, clean white
Right,
coats doing
right.
nice, clean things in well-lit laboratories.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, if I may, in
Mhm.
your own experience, I mean, had you done a lot of street reporting? Were you comfortable like going
I
into these
had.
neighborhoods, or was this like a new thing for you?
I had. No, I actually I like the street reporting. I like the people reporting. I like talking to real people. I like talking to the scientists too. I think you guys are fascinating. It's amazing what you guys find out. But I
Are
also.
they real people? do you
Yeah,
think?
I think so now. But I like the gritty
Uh-huh.
reporting too,
Uh-huh.
and we have to work weekend shifts, so I have to cover shootings on the weekend. So I had been
Okay.
in the neighborhoods. But you know, but I was always cautious because, like I said, I don't come from the neighborhoods. I pulled up
Mhm.
to meet one woman in my story who's like the grandmother of her neighborhood. And I pulled up on the corner, and there were these three women sitting outside on lawn chairs on the sidewalk on a busy urban street corner. And they looked at me immediately. They watched me park. They watched me get out of the car. They watched me walk towards the apartment complex. And finally, I was like, I'm here to see Miss Brewer. They're like, oh, okay, Miss Brewer. And then it was okay. So it was a lot of trust building and getting people to recognize. And some people, I'm not saying I agree with this, but some people, Hopkins has a lot of research in Baltimore, and I
Johns
mean,
Hopkins,
yeah,
yeah.
and you probably know that. So there's some distrust from some people in the community for Hopkins, and some people feel as if researchers come in, they do research, and then they leave, and they're still stuck with all the problems. So I had to deal with some of that too, because the newspaper to them is an institution as well, and
Mhm.
am I coming in to exploit their problems and then tell their
Well, there
story
is a,
and
in
then
Baltimore in
nothing
particular.
happens.
Yeah, in
Yeah.
Baltimore in particular, I mean, I think what New York Magazine,
Mhm.
long piece recently, said, well, Baltimore is a laboratory. If you're interested
Mhm.
in the study of urban
Mhm.
violence or poverty, that's where you go, and that there are more, there are stacks and stacks of studies of
Right.
things going right down to the rise and fall of the number of chicken bones on some corners
Right.
as a way of assessing
Right.
the financial stability and affluence of
Mhm.
a particular project or something.
Right.
So you felt that you had to overcome sort of distrust, not
Oh,
just of you as a
definitely.
journalist, but also of you as someone who was interested in a kind of scientific issue.
Definitely. Oh, definitely.
Mm.
And just more of what are you going to write about? What am I going to see in
Did
the
you
paper?
find at any
So-
point that this neuroscience perspective
Mhm.
started to be of value to you in your street reporting? I mean, that part of the project? I mean, in terms of talking to
Yeah.
your interview subjects and saying, hey, I know you think of it this way, but have you thought of it that way? I mean,
Right, or more helping validate to them what they were experiencing.
what do you mean?
So saying, well, this is why the children are acting out. So one of the places I went to was a daycare center, and at this daycare center, all the daycare workers went through trauma training because the kids were acted out. All 2-year-olds act out to some extent, but they were acting out in ways way beyond, you know, what most people were used to. So some of the daycare workers, even the ones who came from the neighborhood, started to look at these children as just troublemakers, and, you know, there's no helping them. But after understanding the science, after understanding how, you know, hearing gunshots raises the stress level in your body, which makes it hard for you to control your behavior, even they started to understand, you know, the children more. So I think the science helped even the people in the neighborhood understand, if that makes sense, what they were going through and what their kids were going through. And yeah, because some of this has been going on for generations and generations and generations. So even the mothers might not understand why they're so depressed, and if you're depressed, why you can't help your kids. I mean.
So now if I may just shift focus slightly, what led you to undertake Why We Snap?
Well, I was on my way to give a lecture on my research in Barcelona, and usually I travel alone, but my 17-year-old daughter was with me, and we were coming up out of the metro station, and I was robbed, and I instantly threw the guy to the ground, jumped on his back, and put him in a chokehold, which was a dumb thing to do. At that point, I'm on the ground going, what are you doing? And at that moment, I realized that, first of all, I have no martial arts. I don't know, no background in fighting, nothing.
Because if I
no.
may say, you take me, I take you as a kind of low-key fellow. This
Yeah,
isn't-
it's totally, this is, you know, totally out of character. So now I'm on the ground in a street fight, realizing that this signal never went to my cerebral cortex. There was no consciousness involved. And then I realized that, you know, if there's something in your environment that can cause you to engage in violence, risk your life and limb in an instant. I mean, I was just walking up the metro. And it involves no thought. I wanted to understand how that worked, what those triggers were. So that's what led to that inquiry. And then I also realized that that this is a big problem in society, that we are all wired for violence. And this is not in a part of the brain that's conscious. It's in an unconscious part of the brain, the hypothalamus, the same region that controls sex and feeding and thirst. Because we need violence as a species to protect ourselves, to protect our young. As a species, we're carnivores. So then the question is, and if you stimulate this spot in the hypothalamus, called the hypothalamic attack area, with an electrode, the animal will launch into a rage and kill another animal. And that's what happened to me, you know. So then I wanted to understand, well, what is the circuitry that will activate this attack area? So yeah, that's what caused me to, it happened in an instant like that. Clearly that was not the right thing to do. But I wanted to understand the neuroscience, not only why we snap, but how was that possible? I didn't even see the guy, you know, and that led to the very interesting neurocircuitry. So there's a lot of psychology of human violence and aggression, very rich literature. But what's really exciting now is we're getting a neuroscience perspective, going into the brain and saying, looking at violence like a behavior. It's a behavior. What causes this behavior? What circuit in the brain controls this behavior? And when you think about it, violence is risky for an animal or a human, and you're not going to engage in violence for any reason, particularly, you know, even though it seems like when you read the paper, almost anything can set somebody off. So new research is identifying this circuit, these circuits in the brain that trip this area, and there are 9 of them. So although it seems that there are many different kinds of provocations, I've organized the science into these new science into 9 triggers of violence. And this new research is coming about by new methods, optogenetics and genetic engineering. So we can put a camera into the brain of genetically engineered mice so their neurons flash when they fire, and watch and identify which neurons and which circuits are firing when the animal is fighting. Now we know the circuitry. Or scientists are stimulating with lasers certain neurons in the brain and can provoke an attack. And this research is showing that there are separate circuits that are tripped for different kinds of violence. So that's how that started, and that's kind of what this new science is about. And it's very helpful to try and understand when you read these bewildering stories of people snapping or even violence in Baltimore, what caused it? Step back and look at it the way I do as a zoologist. This is an animal behavior. It's very peculiar. What tripped this behavior? And what's the neuroscience behind it? So that was my approach.
Dan, you have a question?
Yeah, I do. So it seems to me that what both your work has in common is that you're providing a biological explanation for this antisocial behavior. And for journalists, that raises all kinds of tricky questions about free will and to what extent is this all deterministic and so I think a lot of people who write about behavior, I know I have in the past when I've written about it, have wrestled with how to characterize this in a way that still leaves some room for individual choice, if individual choice is a part of this. So I'm interested both as writers and then also just, especially Andrea, and you're dealing with people in the community, how do they feel about this idea that this isn't entirely about choice? This is deterministic to some extent. So how do we cover that, and how do people react to those kinds of explanations when you present them to them?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Meaning the people I'm writing about, or the people in the community? I mean, I got some criticism that, well, shouldn't they know right from wrong? You're still committing a violent act, of course, and you are committing a violent act, and you should get some kind of punishment if you kill somebody. But I think helping them to know why it could have happened and the things in somebody's life that can lead to that can help prevent kids from going to this, if that makes sense. So now a lot of the social workers are starting with kids at the youngest levels, even 1-year-olds, and trying to address the issues then and helping them, manage stress and deal with the issues that they grow through. So I think it can be used as a preventive measure. So now that we know what contributes to it, we start helping kids earlier on. But definitely, those issues do come up. And one of the things I was concerned about is, you're writing about people's brains, and you're saying there's something wrong with people's brains. So I was very cautious about. I kept thinking about the bell curve
Sure. Well,
and all the controversy. Yeah, all the controversy that caused years ago. So I was very careful about how I wrote it and the context that I used in the story, and making sure that I had different kinds of studies, because you talk about how the research that's coming 5 years ahead of time. I don't know all the research that's out there, so I'm always very cautious about the context I put in there, making sure I try to find out as much about all the research that is out there, which can be hard when I'm not, when I don't read all the journals every day and I don't know what's out there. So, and just talking to as many people I can to make sure that I have the right context of the story.
Well, I'm going to ask Doug about this too, but let's stay with this for a second, because I think Dan has raised something that's particularly tricky with talking about biological explanations of violent behavior. I wonder there's a huge risk of stigmatizing the people that you're talking about. And as journalists, of course, we're always looking for the great kind of personal narrative of this person who has the disease, but you're talking about an area, a neighborhood of a city that is troubled, in a country that is troubled, in apparently more than other countries by this problem. How do you talk about these kinds of biochemical underlying, and the famous phrase is root causes used to set off alarm bells. So you started talking about root causes of violence. How do you talk about that in a way that doesn't end up giving other people an opportunity to label a group as defective or stigmatize them in some way, especially when you're talking about children?
Right.
I'm sure it's something you and your editors discussed.
It was, and we talked a lot about nuance in stories. So stories to me are never black and white. These children aren't just violent, and every child in the neighborhood is not just violent. It you know, doesn't have behavioral issues. So making sure we talked about the whole community, if that makes sense, and including things like we deliberately put in a sentence that said, you know, these kids are also very cute and they play, you know, tea, and one little girl like loves to put the wig on her head, and so just providing that nuance in the story, so you're showing the full life of people and not just presenting them as these troubled people who need all kinds of help. If that makes sense.
It does make sense.
Yeah.
I'm curious, as a presentational matter, I know you work very closely with a particular photographer. Did the photographic images play a part in trying to balance that?
It did, and there was some discussion on what photo we were going to use on the front page, because there was a photo of, we ended up using a photo of kids at a preschool running. They were playing outside at the daycare, and they were running and laughing. And the other picture we considered was two kids fighting, like two young kids fighting. And we were concerned, we ended up using one of the kids playing, and not everybody agreed. There was a lot of discussion about it. You know, the photographers wanted to use, most of the visual people wanted to use the ones of the kids fighting. I argued against it because I didn't think it told the full story. Once again, I didn't think it showed the nuance of the story, that it just showed two kids fighting, and I worried that people would look at the photo first and just see these problem kids and maybe not read into the nuance of the story. So I argued for that, and we ended up going with the kids playing. So it's definitely a lot of discussion.
We have the question here, so pull the mic down. Thank you.
In relation to the former question about dealing with a biological perspective versus free will, I was wondering, how do you as a scientist and you as a journalist deal with extrapolating animal studies to understand human behavior?
Doug, why don't you give that a shot?
Yeah, that is always difficult. But most of the research that we can do on animals to test causation can't be done on people. But there are new methods. We can look into, with human brain imaging and EEG methods, we can see the human brain working. We can find the same circuits in the brain that is in a mouse, the same circuit in the hypothalamus that's activated when a mother rat protects her pup from a threat. We find that same circuit in the same place in the human brain. So there's always this convergence, but I think it's coming together pretty well, especially with the new techniques of functional fMRI and that kind of thing. And in terms of your other question, my brain made me do it.
Well, it is I would put it to you. So, okay, so you both as a researcher, but also as a popularizer of research, to put you on the same spot we just put Andrea on. When you reduce this to neurocircuits, I mean, that's even taking it down from the traditional psychological literature that you refer to. I mean, it's a real form of reductionism. I mean, you're nothing but a pack of neurons.
Well, the answer is that ultimately you're responsible for your behavior, in the criminal sense and in a social sense. So what I can bring to it with my research is explain why a mother will protect her young. And that may explain why a mother shoots somebody, right, in a tragic situation, because it would be the same circuitry, but it wouldn't excuse it. But the first step to controlling anything is to understand it. And the reason I think it's important to understand this from a neuroscience perspective is that this is a huge problem, violence. We are extremely aggressive animals, especially males. The top cause of death in the United States in every age bracket from 1 to 44, the third to the fifth most frequent cause of death is homicide. It's not disease. And the reason I want to reduce it to circuits partially is that I want everyone to understand that this is not pathology we're talking about. By and large, when you read the paper, about, you know, domestic violence, barroom brawls, everything that fills the paper, and it's horrible. We're not talking by and large about mentally ill people. Yet there's a tendency to dismiss it because it's such a horrible thing. You know, a sudden rage attack or somebody shoots somebody on the highway, that guy must be crazy. Or he snapped, and then we go on. We've learned nothing. So that's why I want to understand human behavior at the level of the organ that's controlling this behavior. And we need to understand violence as a human behavior the same way we understand every other human behavior at the level of brain circuitry. So I don't want to have people dismiss this problem. There's a severe problem, growing problem in society as pathology. It's them. So you're ultimately responsible unless, you know, I interviewed a lot of forensic psychiatrists in the book and grappling with the insanity defense, which is a mess. There is no consistent ruling on the insanity defense. It varies from state to state. Some even don't have an insanity defense, and they have a death penalty. But we're torn between this compassion, realizing that if you can't hold animals and children who don't have cognitive capability responsible for their violent crimes, you also can't really hold somebody who's mentally ill or developmentally disabled criminally responsible. So we're tugged between society trying to find justice and maintain order with, on the other hand, trying to be compassionate. So if you have a dysfunction in the circuitry, again, it'll be neural circuitry, generally from the prefrontal cortex controlling this attack region. If you have a dysfunction there, schizophrenia or something, then most people would not hold that person criminally responsible. Or if you're impaired due to drugs or alcohol, you're still criminally responsible, but the legal system has a diminished capacity for that. So that's the way I view it.
We have a question here, sir. You have a question for us.
Well, I guess.
In the mic, please.
Okay, I guess it's better?
Better? Closer.
Closer, okay. I guess for both of you, the question is, an epigenetic question is that, you know, you have your brain and everything that's programmed, but also you're in a certain environment. And I guess I know Baltimore, I guess being the Druid environment you know, you have peers who are violent, and so is there a learned aspect to this as well, besides what's going on in your brain? You know,
Is violence a learned behavior? Is it a situational? Is that?
Yeah,
okay.
Or neighborhood, socioeconomic, things like that. I mean, it's not only just the brain.
Okay.
Well, the function of the brain is to interact with the environment, and so the environment affects the brain, and the human brain develops after birth. A newborn baby can't do anything. The brain is not really formed yet. So the human brain continues to develop until the early 20s. And that's so your experience can control the way your brain wires. If you grow up in a hostile neighborhood, it's going to affect the way your brain wires. So this is not pathology. This is why we have this influence of the environment on the brain. It's the way we cheat evolution. We develop our brain in the environment we're born into for maximum success in that environment, rather than the environment we had as cavemen. So if you're born into a hostile environment, some of these areas of Baltimore, that's going to change your wiring of your threat detection and response mechanism in your brain. It's going to be on a high trigger. That's not pathology. If you walk through those neighborhoods, as I have, during the Baltimore riots, the hair rises on the back of your neck. It's scary. And you imagine a kid trying to grow up in that environment. They don't have a chance. So their brain will be, so as not to be victimized, they become more aggressive. That's a survival mechanism. And it will work for them in that environment, perhaps, but it won't work in society at large. So it's always, like everything in biology, it's a combination of genes, environment, and chance.
So, Andrea, if I may, we kind of got into a discussion here for a minute or two, looking sort of squarely at violent acts, but what you were really focusing on was kind of these secondary effects of the sustained stress of being in such an environment. Could you share with us the symptoms, if you like, that you were writing about?
Can I say something about
You
the learn
sure
too?
can.
Okay.
You sure can.
So, I don't know. I don't have any scientific evidence to back this up, but you, I mean, you do hear, like a couple of weeks ago, the police, some undercover police officers were just driving through the neighborhood routine. They came upon two guys who came out of a car and had pulled their guns out, were getting ready to shoot people across the street. The cops shot the guys before they shot the people across the street. True story. Crazy. And they find out the shooters were a father and son, so who were in the game together. So I guess in some sense, I mean, this is what these kids see, and sometimes, you know, there are family members of gangs. I don't know if that's learned or not, to answer your question, but if you're in an environment and that's all you know and kind of that's all you see in life, then maybe, you know, it does influence somewhat. But I do think what you said, that, but still living with that stressor. And I mean, you hear about kids all the time who they carry weapons to walk to school because they never know when they're going to get attacked. There's a mentality of, I'm going to get you before you get me, because everybody's scared of who's going to get who, you know, at some point in time. So I don't know if that's learned or not, but I don't know if learned, but environmental, I guess, is a...
The other aspect, you mentioned gangs, is tribalism. Humans are very tribalistic, and the neural circuitry is quite understood. You know, within 170 milliseconds of you seeing another person, there's a part of the brain that categorizes that person into us versus them. And you know, as we evolved as a species, when we encountered a strange group, that was a threat. So we have that, but that same circuitry is what binds us together. So you know, we're completely helpless without our society, and forming cooperative groups is the success of human beings. I mean, you think about it, we can go shirts and skins and play at the fastest pace that we can in complete efficiency, us versus them. That's remarkable, and that's the key to our success. But that same circuitry leads to this violence when a cop will see this person as them because he's a black person or something. So, but the other thing with gangs is we need to belong to a group. And I interviewed the relatives of the Boston bombers, and this is what I learned from this story, is that had nothing, you know, had nothing to do really with Islamic extremism. It had to do with failing to integrate into a group, a failed family.
Failed family.
We all need to be successful. If you're not successful in your group, you'll find somebody who you can assimilate with, and in a bad neighborhood, that's a gang. And unfortunately, now that we
or
have
for protection.
But
Or a
also,
dysfunctional police department. I mean,
yeah, but also you
no,
need
it
to
cuts
be
both ways.
you need to be part of a group.
Yeah.
Look, if we're out 24 hours in the country, backwoods for 24 hours, they send out the helicopters because you're going to die on your own. We have a very strong need to be part of a group, and terrorism is just now, you know, a global gang. It's just the worst. The worst mind and the most evil person on the planet.
Let me pull us back to
Yeah.
neurocircuits. I have something I want to ask you in a sec, but I'd like to take this question first.
So what I'd like to know is that, you know, oftentimes when presented with research that kind of codifies you, people can revolt or react quite strongly or negatively. You know, if you tell somebody what to do, they're going to say, well, I'm not going to do that. So how have sort of your audiences and the folks who are actually in these scenarios reacted to your work, and have you sort of been considering them and thinking about like their reactions and whether, I mean, and then I guess the second part of that question is, do you think that you're instilling change and that sort of, that those gears have been set off in motion?
So make sure I understand that. So first part of the question, how did people react?
Yeah, how is the
framed-
people who
to being framed
you're actually
as
doing the research about reacting?
Okay.
And the
then
second
two,
is-
did you change anything?
Exactly.
So,
Right.
Andrea, how did people in the neighborhoods react to reading about themselves as examples of a pathology that was
Yeah.
stemming from the
Right.
impact of sustained stress on their neural circuits?
Right. I think because I wrote about it with more of a, I don't know if this is the right word, like more of a compassionate tone. I didn't write about them as problems. I wrote more about it as this is what people go through, and this is, I don't know, I'm not explaining myself well, but I think there's a way you can write it. You can write it as these people are problems in our city, or you can write it as this is what happening to children. And in the end we chose to write about children in the first story because children, you're boring, but you don't really control what's happening to you as a 2 or 3 year old. So we thought people would better understand. It's just about tone. So we all come at stories with our own perspective, our own life experience, our own tones. So it's all about how you write it. So instead of writing about them as problems, we wrote about, and I think also including what people were doing in the community to address the problem also helped. I don't know that I answered your question.
What kind of
I
feedback
kind of
did you
rambled,
get?
yeah. And it was mostly, we feel bad for these kids. What can we do? One woman donated $10,000 to Promise Heights. Promise Heights was able to get a $75,000 grant to address violence in the community. And we also did a video project. So we didn't want to just do the story and leave. So we also did a follow-up video project where we gave cameras to teens in the neighborhood, and they went and talked about, what's bad about their neighborhood and what they can do better. And then we had a community forum, so that kind of helped keep the issue going too. And there is concern from some people in the community. I mean, one woman told us, that we're going to exploit them, but in the end, that woman liked the video and was okay with the story. So I think it's all about tone and balance and nuance. Like I talked about the nuance before, and it sounds like a little thing, but I think it's really important because you show that some of these families are troubled, but they still love their kids. They still want the best for their kids. Moms who lose their sons to violence, even if they're bad kids, they still lost their son, so they still grieve. So I think just showing all sides of the story also helps with that.
So if I may ask, as you started to narrow this from a topic, from a subject area, which is kind of where we all start as journalists when we're taking on something big, into a story, and you started encountering the research and working through that. I wonder, how did you avoid? Brain research is just full of half-baked ideas.
Oh,
I say this with respect, but historically, they're just more bad ideas per square inch.
Right.
As we have learned about this very complicated thing, how did you filter that?
Just talking to as many scientists as I could. I think you have to do as much reporting as you can so you understand the issue, even if you don't use it all in your story, and a lot of it I didn't use. But interviewing as many people as I could and getting the best understanding that I could helped me weed out what I thought could be included and couldn't be included.
Were there particular researchers that you eventually relied on as guides, or did you say sounding boards, or did you go look at impact scores and citation indexes?
Well, no, I didn't go that far. but if there was research that showed the same outcome in several studies, then I could say, oh, well, that must be something. And then Harvard has a child development center, and they're Harvard, so if and actually they never called me back for the story, so I couldn't use them. But
right.
you probably
they're
get
Harvard,
called,
but they
you
never
probably
call
get
you
called,
back.
you probably
so
get
that's,
called back, so that helped as well. And then I think, and one of the things I wrote about, there was a professor at Hopkins that didn't agree with some of the research that was out there. So I just put that in there, that there was somebody that didn't agree with some of the research that was out there. So just presenting that, like, once again, context, just presenting the context.
So
Just
Doug,
people
let me
know.
ask you kind of your version of the same question.
Yeah.
Clearly, you feel a need to be talking to the public about this stuff. I assume in part it's because you feel this is a work in progress and maybe there are wrong-headed ideas out there. I don't know. What is it from your standpoint?
I found everyone was very eager, very interested in sharing their story, and I interviewed a wide range of people, so I was really kind of shocked. Everyone felt this need to want to understand, so I interviewed a huge range of people, even to people who are completely nonviolent. People wanted to understand. And the reaction has been good. I've had people contact me saying, for example, Sergeant Bales, who had who murdered those people in Afghanistan. He was a model soldier. There's no explanation for what he did. And I had recently a colleague of his thank me that he'd read the book and now he understands. I helped him understand. Police have said the same thing. They've told me, they have this saying, it's never about what it's about. There's always a backstory. And so understanding the neuroscience behind it helped. I've had somebody write and say, yeah, everything in the book is right and it really helps, and I have to confess I can't live with it anymore. I committed this murder, and he gave me all the contact information.
I'm sorry, you can't gloss over that.
I
You can't
know.
gloss over that.
Oh,
We call that burying the lead.
sorry.
I'm sorry, so this
I
person
just gave it
called,
to the police.
This is a remarkable reaction to a book. Person called and says, I really love your book, I can't argue with
I
anybody.
haven't told this
And
story
by,
before.
and by the way, I killed somebody?
Yeah, because people,
No, seriously, what happened?
I
This
just
is
turned it over to the
remarkable.
police. I turned it, but there's even a more remarkable story that I do tell in the book, and that is that,
You said you turned it over to the police?
yeah.
Did
What else could you do?
Yeah.
Um,
Did he know you were going to
yeah,
do
thank you.
Well,
Yeah.
essentially, he turned himself in to me because he gave me all his contact information. He couldn't live with it anymore.
Oh, so you think he wanted to?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And have you
No.
followed up?
No. Actually,
That
it's
cause
great
trauma
being
in
a
you? No, I'm
journalist,
kidding.
but you actually don't want to cultivate relationships with murderers if you can avoid it. I find. But
As a journalist, you can't avoid it.
I know, and it's
mean,
scary.
For your
It's
weekend,
scary.
Yeah.
your
Oh, yeah.
weekend shift.
But to give a more personal example, and I didn't
Okay,
tell
all
about
right.
this one in the book, during the course of writing this book, two people I know were involved in, I have to call it a homicide,
Wow.
because the trial's not completed. But it was committed in rage. And so I knew both the victim and the perpetrator. It may be self-defense, and it may be rage murder or something the courts have to decide. But those people involved in that had a 20-year relationship, tight mentor relationship. And this is just devastating to everyone who knew them both, who had no idea that anything like this would happen. But it happens every day. It happens every day. So the reaction I've been getting is good because this is so bewildering, this aspect of human nature, this violent aspect of human nature. That we want to understand it. If you understand it, you can control it.
Hi, that actually just touches on the question I was going to ask. So I think we tend to discuss violence a lot in a particular scenario, in anecdotal ways, in a particular context, like inner city violence feels super American in a lot of ways. Is there anything that you've encountered in your respective types of research that applies more generally to like human nature or the global context?
Well, I think.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
go ahead, you
I'm
first.
sorry.
No,
You
go
seemed
ahead.
like you were thinking.
I am thinking. I'm still thinking.
No, it's a good question.
It is a good question.
Yes, so look, it's not all about physical violence. It is about, losing your temper. It's the same triggers are involved in that sort of thing. Okay, what is anger? Anger is an emotion preparing you to fight. You're not going to fight as a behavior except for very specific reasons. The problem is trying to identify in the fluid situation and in the modern world what's triggering that. But all of these same circuits are involved when you feel angry and road rage, or you have a verbal altercation at work or with a friend. So, and then the other aspect of your question is, we've been talking about individuals, but the same process, biology, is at play on a societal and a nation-wide scale, because leaders of groups and nations, political leaders, candidates, they're the product of a mind, an individual's mind. So these same triggers of violence we see cropping up again and again as the cause for wars, the cause for riots, the cause for violence breaking out in political campaigns and political rallies, right? That's tribalism. So it's the same circuitry.
You've had a chance to think, Andrea. You want
Yeah,
to...
well, I was thinking, well, I think the same thing happens in domestic violence situations, and then there's the ACEs study. Are you familiar with the ACEs study? Where
the what?
ACEs, so it's done back in the 90s, and it's stressors that can affect all people and have an impact on how they react in life later. And it can be divorce, or it can be, I'm trying to think some examples, attachment. If your mom wasn't close to you as a child and you have trouble when you're older, relating to people, which can cause violent incidents as well. Yes, yes. Which can.
Would you
so
repeat
it's
that?
not just
Would you repeat
adverse.
that so that people could
Was
hear?
it Kaiser Permanente that did it, or?
Kaiser Permanente? Was it?
Was it Kaiser Permanente? Yeah, yeah,
Oh,
yeah.
okay, okay, never mind,
I
never
can't
mind.
remember all the details now. So it's not just violence. I just happen to write about it because of where I am, but it does play out in other areas as well, definitely.
There's a question here.
Yeah, I'd like to ask both of you about intervention. So there are brain circuits that you mentioned, Doug, 9 brain circuits that cause us to snap, but the brain also has plasticity, and there are possible ways of intervening both. I'm interested in what you found in your research, both in terms of social interventions and also how it affects the brain in terms of interrupting the cycle of violence.
Yes, so let's, Andrea, if you don't mind starting off with an answer to that. I mean, in your reporting, did you find this research was working its way into classrooms, into clinics, into intervention programs, or was it lagging? So tell us about that.
Yeah, no, there's, it's not in every school, but like some other schools are doing things like circle time. So in the morning, all the students sit in a circle, particularly after a weekend, and they talk about what happened to them over the weekend. And that gives them a chance to talk about if something, like if they did see a shooting, or somebody died in the community. So it gets it out in the open, so it doesn't, so then they're not thinking about it in class, or they just don't, there's not just a sudden outburst because it's on their mind. So now it's, it's out in the open. They're doing mindfulness. There's a lot of mindfulness going on in the schools now, where they're teaching kids how to deal with their stress. One of the things that was common in a lot of these children was runners. So a lot of kids, they always want to flee, so they just literally like run out the door. So teaching kids how to cope, so they're not just running. Like one teacher social worker used to chase the kid all over the place, and finally she was like, she just stopped chasing her, and then finally the kid started coming back to her. So all kinds of things, like even just stress balls, allowing the kids to come to the social worker's office when they're having problems. They gave one little girl a doll, so when she was feeling upset, she would hold the doll, and that would help her deal with the stress of the problems. Or there was so much they were doing, which is good. I was glad to find that out. Even in textures, so like a piece of velvet on the wall, so the kid would rub the velvet, and somehow that soothed some children. Yeah, so there was a lot of innovative stuff that they were trying to do. Now, I don't know, maybe you would know more if the science is there to back it up, but they say the brain can't change, correct?
Absolutely.
And you're right, that the brain. if you have these intervention efforts.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So I told a member of SEAL Team 6 about my incident with the pickpocket, and he said, "Oh yeah, I never would have done that." And you know, here's a guy who judo chopped somebody, and well, without even thinking about it, incapacitated, but he wouldn't ever have done it. And they train to inhibit this response and to perfect it. Do you
To
think-
inhibit the response.
Yeah, and to exploit it as well. And another example, do you think I will react the same way the next time? I hope not. And to the other extreme, I interview people who are strictly nonviolent, Quakers, Jains, a religious group, Jains, who,
Yeah.
these are the people who are vegetarian, they sweep the path in front of them so they don't step on ants, that sort of thing. And I visited their, one of their temples, completely nonviolent. So that's a mixture of genetics and environment, but very much because they're kind of a closed group. But they are strictly nonviolent, and it's very interesting. So to see how they do that, they avoid these triggers, but they have a huge price. Because we have this circuitry because we need it. It's just that it misfires occasionally. They give up a lot. So when I went to their meeting, they skew all ambition. You know, the religion is about separating your soul from worldly desires, so I understand. But they were talking about the beheading and burning alive of the soldier in the Middle East that had just happened when I was there. And they were talking about how you can't judge that. You can't say it's good or bad. It's just, you know, their karma. So that shows the extent to which you can control this, but there is a cost. I would think and I'm not judging those people. They're amazing people, but I have a hard time accepting that kind of cruelty and brutality in society. And
No, you got to go to the microphone. Got to go. We got other people here who are trying to listen. They're disembodied. We
Yeah.
can't see them, but we need to honor their virtual presence. Sorry. So, please use the microphone.
You said that, going back a little, if you were to be attacked again, you would hope you wouldn't react the way you did before. But why do you think you would be able to react differently this time around? What about your experience allowed your brain to change?
Interesting.
understanding why it happened, how the circuitry works, because again, this is a really complex brain function. We're all enamored with consciousness and memory. Right? The cerebral cortex is 3 millimeters thick. Most of what your brain does is unconscious. And the brain's threat detection mechanism is taking in all this information constantly, and you're not aware of it. Your conscious mind can't hold it, and your conscious mind is too slow. So I don't know how I will react, because the fact is that your unconscious mind takes in all the situation information, internal, external, every sense in your body goes to the amygdala before, the high-speed pathway to your brain's threat detection mechanism before it ever goes to your consciousness. And it has to respond quickly. For speed, secondly, because of sensory overload. Our conscious mind, working memory is, you can hold 7 digits. That's pathetic. That's pathetic. So even if your conscious mind, your unconscious mind, which has taken in all of this information about your situation and your internal state, your level of stress, when you read my book, you'll see why I reacted that way. I'll just tell you now. I'd been robbed previously on that trip. All right? So it wasn't going to happen again. Still wasn't conscious, but my...
Oh, so you actually learned the
wow.
other lesson.
Oh,
The
Yeah.
first time I
Yeah.
was very mellow and nonviolent about it,
You see,
but now my unconscious
Yes.
has learned to punch out.
yeah, so I've
Okay,
given away the book. But and that learning is in the amygdala. It's not in the cortex. It still isn't that I thought about it. But let me contrast. You understand that you have, through coded in your DNA, this neural reflex. If you touch a hot stove, you pull away before it goes to your brain. And we know that circuit never even gets to the brain until you've pulled it away. It's life-saving. But that's simple. Consider what I did in Barcelona, a fluid situation with all this information, trying to figure out where I am in what's the right response. That's really complicated. So what I'm saying is I hope I wouldn't misfire, but when you talk to people who rely on this kind of circuitry, they talk about trusting their gut, because even if your unconscious mind could lay out all the reasons that you need to attack this person, your conscious mind couldn't deal with it, right? So you can't know in any sudden dangerous situation what is the right response. Sometimes it's going to be to run, sometimes it's going to be to freeze or flee or fight. But your unconscious brain, in a fraction of a second, makes that decision and sets you on a course before your cerebral cortex gets involved. That's really fascinating to me. But misfires are a different thing. I know that I'm not going to get into money is not worth dying or being kicked in the head, in a gang fight and having a coma. So I will not allow that to happen unless it really is life or death, unless it's a situation where these circuits were designed to confront. And this happens on the freeway. So now, I don't get road rage anymore, which implies that I did before.
Pretty strongly.
I think we all do.
Well,
but now I understand why. Now I understand which of these triggers is being set off inappropriately, and it just instantly takes away the misfiring and the rage goes.
So Andrew, let me ask you a question, because this is something that I think affects writing for the public about any research area, but it's particularly knotty, I think, when talking about neuroscience and brain issues. I mean, you're happily talking about triggers and the unconscious and things, but those are all, that's English, that's not the actual technical description of what's going on. How, when you're writing for your readers in Baltimore and in the surrounding area, I mean, how do you handle the nightmare of neuroscience jargon?
Right. It's hard. So I try to ask, so when I'm doing my interviewing, I try to ask the scientists to dumb it down as much as they can. I ask for analogies. Can you give me, is this analogous to a car doing this or something like that? I will go back. I will bug a scientist to death. I will call them 4 or 5 times to make sure I got it right. And as I simplify it down, I'll call back to make sure I didn't simplify it down so much that I took out the accuracy of it. And sometimes scientists can be sometimes scientists can be very specific. So they how am I trying to say this? So something that they see, this specific detail needs to be in, I think a reader wouldn't notice. So sometimes there's some negotiating with that. Would a reader really read it that way, if that makes sense? So it's all about interviewing as many scientists first as you can, even if you don't use it, so you understand what you're writing about, first of all, and then making, writing it in as plain language as you can, but making sure that it's accurate by going back to the scientists and making sure you understand.
Doug, this impenetrable jargon, the neurogeography, I mean, the area of this, I mean, that's your stock in trade. I mean, this is how you talk to yourself in your dreams. So how do you distance yourself from it for the purposes of talking to us?
I think the jargon is a big problem, and it's a pretty simple problem. You just get rid of the jargon. And that's not dumbing it down. What you're trying to do is communicate the concepts. And you look at the scientific jargon, and it's the basolateral amygdala or the mediolateral hypothalamus. That's pretty crappy jargon. It doesn't really convey anything except maybe where this is in the brain, and there's no context. So I look at it. If you took your car to a mechanic and asked him what's wrong with it, and he starts talking to you in jargon, that's that's not helpful. You need to know what's wrong with the car in a way that you can understand it. And so that's all I do. I just explain the important concepts. The jargon's not important to me. I will put it in there for anybody who wants to know. You know, so you can go research it, and I will reference it. But by and large, people are not there to learn vocabulary. And this issue of jargon is not just with the public, it's between me and my colleagues. You know, I go across the hall and I can't understand a word he said. You know?
Well, it is an issue, yeah.
And then when they finally explain it, it's no big deal.
Do you have a quick
And
question
I think,
here?
oh,
I'm
I was
sorry,
going to say, I
please.
think
Go ahead.
I was a business reporter for years. It's the same with the CEOs.
Yeah.
They talk in
Right.
biz talk. The
It's irritating.
politicians talking government talk. So
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah, we cloak ourselves
Yeah.
in jargon. Journalists have
Yeah,
their
we
version of it.
talking journalists talk,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So.
Sir.
I do have a quick question. First, Doug, I don't think you should go back to Barcelona.
I'm not going back.
My question is, what do you think of people who write about your work and write about
Yeah,
your
I'd
science,
like to
write
know
about
that.
That's a good
neuroscience?
question. Thank you.
What do I
Good
think
question.
about people who write about my book?
About your work?
Neuroscience
Yeah.
in general.
Do people
Yeah.
get it right? Do we get it right?
Oh, I understand your question.
Yeah, we understand that you get it right.
Okay.
But what about
Do
the
we
rest
get
of
it
us?
right?
What
First
about
of
the
all,
rest
one of
of
the
us?
reasons I enjoy this is that, look, scientists are really interesting people. They're creative, they're intelligent, they're wonderful. So are journalists. So I love journalists. I love science writers. But to understand, and so they almost, you know, I have a great relationship with them. But I have had journalists, both broadcast and print journalists, and it's not, it happens, apologize after the article comes out because it's been hyped, sensationalized, and they're embarrassed. That happens. But because I know what they're going through, I can be kind of understanding. You know, I think journalists do an amazing job, I think, to society, and really they're sharing a lot of the same skills that scientists have, you know, discovery and going to primary sources, and I'm very pleased with what they write usually, but you know, there are these pressures, and sometimes it gets sensationalized, but I understand.
So let me flip the question, I guess, Andrea, and ask you. So often scientists themselves, or people who are involved most intimately with research, you know, feel it's appropriate that they write about it because they actually know what they're talking about. But I wonder, Andrea, if you sort of feel that maybe scientists are a little too close to their research sometimes, a little too boosterish.
Well.
And do you think that the necessary distance that a journalist brings to it
Right.
is an advantage or a disadvantage?
Right. I don't know if boosterish is the word, but sometimes scientists, they're following up on studies. They want new people for their study, for their clinical trials, if it's the next phase. Sometimes scientists have products, I guess. So, but it's a matter of, or down the road, maybe they're thinking of, you know, sun or products. So it's a matter of balanced reporting and making sure that they aren't just, you know, trying to boost something and putting context once again, and if it's an early study, making sure you point that out, pointing out the flaws in the study, because no study is perfect, et cetera. But yes, every now and then. But most scientists, I don't know, I like working with most scientists. Most of them are pretty gracious and willing to explain things, you know, over and over again sometimes. So, and I think scientists have gotten a lot better at explaining stuff at a, you know, more basic level too, to be honest.
More willing to reach out?
Yeah. So.
You have a question here?
Yes, I was wondering, I guess part of your distance might help with this, but as a writer or as a journalist, how do you decide how much of the science to include for your audience? Or, like you mentioned, sometimes scientists are really specific in the ideas that they convey to you. Which ones do you choose to use, and how do you filter out the ones that you choose or leave behind?
Yeah. I don't know if there's an exact I don't know if there's an exact method. You kind of get a feel for it after a while. How much? I mean, you don't want to bog down the story with science because you are writing for a general audience, so then people won't read it. But I don't know if there's like a formula of 50% science, 50% not. It's just kind of a feel you get, I guess, after a while, if that makes sense.
So let me ask a funding question.
Uh-huh.
If you think you've... So
Funding?
I'm kind of struck by a certain kind of confluence here that it's not just that, you're more actively involved in writing about general matters for the public, and you're more actively involved in writing about technical matters for the public, so you're kind of straying into each other's territory. You're working off a book advance and kind of conventional writers funding, but now you were able to kind of do this project because, no disrespect to the Baltimore Sun, which is a fine and respectable paper, but strapped like all media outlets, this was enabled by a fellowship, right, from the USC Annenberg School, from their Center for Health Journalism. That's what got you the year, right?
Right. Well,
Or
I didn't. Yeah. So I worked on it for a year, but I covered my beat through most of that time, and really only got like the last. Maybe
well,
3
what I
months.
was wondering was
Oh.
whether
Oh.
that's the future of this kind of reporting. That
Oh, right.
if you really want to be able to do in-depth science, medical reporting of the kind
Right.
that you did, you have to look for funding outside the newsroom. Is that your sense? I mean,
yeah, definitely. Newsrooms are doing much more of that. We had a reporter in the past year teach at Marquette University, and he's been reporting a story. I don't know if I can reveal it or not because it's an investigative piece, but he's been reporting a story, and I'm pretty sure part of that was we got some kind of funding, and we recently got funding from, I don't know if you're familiar with, it's called Solutions Journalism. It's a group that tries to get reporters to write stories from a solutions perspective. So included in the stories, what are solutions to whatever problem you're addressing. And they work with another group that also has that provides funding for newspapers. So newspapers are definitely looking for more innovative ways to get funding from nonprofits and families who just believe in journalism, which is great for us because it gets harder and harder.
Does that funding come with strings?
No, because we wouldn't do it. Yeah, we wouldn't do it otherwise. They're my editors are they want to know, as you probably remember, I had to ask you who was funding this. Yeah, so they want to, we wouldn't take anything from drug companies or probably nothing from Hopkins because they're such a major institution that we cover. So no, we definitely wouldn't do it if there were strings attached to it. Yeah. So family foundations are good, particularly like the one I can't remember the name of it, but the one we're dealing with now. They're not in Baltimore. They have nothing to do with our coverage, and they just believe in journalism, so they're providing funding. So.
And there are an increasing number of such outlets.
Yes. Yes, I think it's great because we don't have money for travel anymore. Budgets are just really tight, so to have this nonprofit funding definitely helps.
Yeah. If I may sort of turn that question a little inside out, as a government scientist, you have, what restrictions do you face on your ability to moonlight as a public intellectual or as a public research communicator?
Well, in the government, anything I would do like that has to be approved. As an approved outside activity. I have to apply and explain it. But your question in the broader...
Did you have to apply and explain this?
This I didn't because it was related to the book, and the book has already been approved as an outside activity.
I see, okay.
Had I come here as an official capacity from representing the NIH, then I would have to go through a very different procedure and have that analyzed and approved before I could accept the invitation. But you asked me because of my general interest in the book, and that has already been approved.
But you were going to say
ask those questions in private. But in a general sense, it's very treacherous to be a scientist and also try to write for the public, and there are good reasons for that. First of all, the scientific method is based on not authority, but on data. So you don't want to have, you know, the authority of the advocate for the science involved. So that's one reason. Another reason is that, yeah, so you don't want to be self-promotional. Another problem is that the perception that any time I spend writing an article for a magazine is time that I could have spent at the bench. And you know, James Watson talks about that same complaint in his book. And that's hard to refute. So your boss says, you spent all this time writing for magazines, you know. And now, if I'd been home drinking beer and watching TV, there'd be no problem. But it's very public what I do. The third thing is, a lot of you are have science interests. You could come into my lab and do science if you wanted. And I would expect that there would be some disasters and some explosions and some mistakes. And I don't have the training as a journalist that you guys are all getting right now. And so I'm learning by an apprenticeship, by having editors help me, but that's also very treacherous because I make the mistakes that you're all being trained and given the skills to deal with properly. So there are a lot of reasons not to do what I do. I just can't help it.
So we're getting near the end of our time, and maybe I'd like to kind of wrap up by asking you this question, which is then, what advice would you give to a fellow researcher, a PhD student or a postdoc or someone who's running a lab who feels strongly about what they're doing, feels strongly about their research either in this specific way or more broadly like you? What advice would you give them in terms of how to reach out, how to make a connection to the general public?
Do it. Everything I do is supported by all my fellow citizens. I believe everyone is a scientist, and they are scientists. You know, they may be driving a cab or whatever they're doing, but they give tax money because they care about the world and their bodies and science. They're curious. It's human nature. And all they want to know is, what did we do? What did I learn with the money that I was given? I encourage scientists to do it. I would also encourage scientists to write about important issues, because these scientific issues become social issues. I don't think the First Amendment is a right. I think it's a responsibility. And even though there are problems, we should, if you don't exercise your rights, you don't deserve to have them. And finally, I would say, yeah, there's truth on all sides, but pendulum swings. You know, 100 years ago, professors professed. They gave lectures. People came in. And when I do that, when I have opportunities to do that, you know, for example, the World Science Festival, I look out there and there were 500 people in the audience who paid money to come and hear a bunch of scientists sit up here like this and talk. And it was so heartwarming, and, you know, especially when you see reality TV and everything, you know, you start to lose faith in mankind, but people are curious. So I think scientists should do more of it. And I guess finally, and I quit, doing it actually helps. If you can learn actually how to write, what a narrative and how to create a narrative, you can write a much better grant. You can write a much better scientific paper.
I see.
And one of the biggest obstacles that I see in scientists is they can't write. They can't write because it's very hard.
Well, the NYU Center here, the places a special premium, I feel obliged to say as a plug in helping scientists learn to write for the general public. So I appreciate, in principle, the endorsement. And Andrea, I also appreciate the time and wisdom and insight you've offered us. The two of you have really been great in helping us see the issues that you've plumbed and how best we might navigate them in our own work. So I want to ask you all to think about what you're going to be doing on May 4th and cancel that and join us for the last of our Kavli Conversations this spring, when we'll be talking with Ian Tattersall and Gibbons about human origins, subject close to all of us. And in the meantime, please join me in applause for our two wonderful guests this evening.
Thank you.